This episode is brought to you by Rebecca Wellington, who is an adoptee, teacher, and historian. The history of adoption is rarely told from the adoptee's perspective. Rebecca remedies this gap by framing the chronicle of adoption using her own life story, which includes enduring the death of her adopted sister. As she reckons with the pain and unanswered questions of her own experience, she explores broader issues surrounding adoption in the U.S. Rebecca's greatest hope is that her book, Who is a Worthy Mother? An Intimate History of Adoption, can be a catalyst for change in the adoption and foster care policy and practice. Visit RebeccaWellington.com to get your copy today. This is the Inclusion Conversation. I'm your host, Grace Young Foster, founder and CEO of the Inclusion Initiative. I'm an adoptee, I'm a foster care alum, and I'm passionate about elevating our communities. It's time we're included and visible in the conversations about work, careers, and just life. Let's be visible and let's be loud. Join me now. Hey, welcome everyone to the Inclusion Conversation podcast. I'm your host, Grace Young Foster. Really excited about today's episode. I have my friend here, Rebecca Wellington, with us. And, Becca and I met just over a year ago in adoptee-centered spaces. We're both doing work to really center and reclaim narratives of our identities, of how we want to tell our stories. And I was building the Inclusion Initiative and met Becca through her work with her book, Who is a Worthy Mother? And so thrilled to have her as a guest today on our show. And stick around after the show for information on how to get in touch with Rebecca. It'll all be provided in the show notes. But without further ado, let me introduce our guest to you today. So, Who is a Worthy Mother is Becca's first book. She's now working on a second, Breaking Boundaries, Activism and Acculturation at Chemawa Indian School. Rebecca was driven to write a history of adoption in the United States from the perspective of an adoptee and to honor the memory of her older sister and the truth of brave women everywhere. Becca, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Grace. It's such an honor to be part of your awesome podcast.
Yay! Yeah, when you wanted to be a guest on our show, when I reached out, I was thrilled. Thrilled for many reasons because, your years of work on this book, your research in helping to really condense 100 years of history of adoption in this country, and also, the child welfare system as a whole is so, it's so important, but I don't think it's not well known, unfortunately, in the adoptee circles, right? And I think because it's a lot of us have struggled so much with highlighting this identity as a part of who we are publicly, because we're always responding to the narratives in society of, you should be grateful for what you have. You should be grateful that your family adopted you. You really shouldn't seek out more for yourself, right? Because you look what you already were able to receive as an adoptee. Like, this should be enough. And so when we're constantly responding and reacting and internalizing those messages, we don't take the time to really understand the history of these systems that have given us these messages for so long, given our parents these messages for so long, and have really dominated and shaped how we navigate our adult lives as adoptees and as foster care alum, and just generally people who have experienced the child welfare system. And so your book is such a it's a very robust book, but I will say it's the beginning, right, of unpacking and learning this important history. And it's the beginning for a lot of adoptees, quite frankly, in our journeys towards reclamation and understanding what it means for ourselves to be adoptees and how we want to tell that story. And understanding history is so important to storytelling and moving forward as a community, no matter what a community you're part of. Understanding the history, where you come from, how your community was shaped is critical to advancing progress, but also justice and equity too. And so I'm so thrilled that you wrote this book, so appreciative that you dedicated such a large part of your career to be able to do so. And now as a clinical instructor
In
at the
Tacoma,
University,
Washington.
yes, of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. I think that the academic lens that you bring to the book as well, and the academic lens that you're bringing to highlight the adoptee experience and the adoptee history, is just something that's it's so lacking in our society and our understanding of these systems. So with all that being said, and I know there's quite a few people working on all of this, but it's hard for us to really have a loud voice. So the more people that join our efforts, the more people that join you and write more books like this, it's so critical, right? To helping our community feel seen and heard and valued. And with all that being said, I really wanted to open our episode with just hearing a little bit about how you experience your identity as an adoptee, especially now and as an adult.
Thanks, Grace. So I'll do kind of a short version. I lived, a lot of people talk about being in the fog, right? Which was a term I didn't even know about before I wrote the book. But I spent most of my life, living in that narrative that you describe of being grateful and not questioning, sort of not looking behind the curtain or understanding. I got a doctorate in history and I had no idea what the history of adoption was or history of foster care, which is insane because that's our history, right? And then, two things really sort of woke up out of that. One was when I gave birth to my first daughter. I think as adoptees, when we don't have connections with our biological families, giving birth to our own children, as we both have, it's like life altering to see your own flesh and blood, your people, meet your people for the first time in your life. So that really started to wake me up. And then 4 years after my second daughter was born, my sister, who was also adopted, and who relinquished a baby for adoption, she died of a drug overdose. And that was it. My life was just upended. And I had just finished my doctorate in education history. And I wanted to find out, sort of my history and find out where I came from. And I started looking and all the doors shut in my face. And I basically was told, you cannot access any information about your past. And I was like, okay, that's a problem. And so out of sort of like sheer desperation, I started, and this was also kind of, especially I got catapulted into this in 2020, COVID hit, and all of the archives that I was doing research in for my, what I thought would be my first book, which is my academic research on student resistance to assimilation education in off-reservation boarding schools. All of those doors shut. I couldn't, literally the archives were shut down. And so writing this book was sort of like, it was like my Hail Mary to like save myself when I had nothing, there was nothing else I could do. I had to find out answers as to why I couldn't get answers. That's sort of how I describe the journey of desperately writing this book. And I wrote it, like you shared, I wrote it for my sister because she was really silenced her whole life, and then she died a horrible death. And I think she wasn't understood as an adoptee. Neither of us were, but she especially. And that she was also a birth mother who had, relinquished a child and died just in a lot of pain. I was like, I needed to rewrite her story, and get a bunch of answers. And that's how the book came about.
Yeah.
And I will follow up. I have to share this, Grace. My commitment to myself after writing this book was to start a biofamily search, and I'm on that search path.
Oh,
wow. Yeah, it's crazy. I did ancestry.com just like a month and a half ago, and I'm working with a search angel through Adoption Network Cleveland, and
wow.
Like I'm like this close to, like, I think January 2025, I'll be possibly reaching out to try to make some contact with some of my biological family. So that's like the next journey.
Oh gosh, that's wonderful. And I know it's so complicated, and like,
Yeah.
so many different emotions must be simultaneously going on for you with thinking about your sister, right? And like not being able to have her with you when that happens. Like that, my heart breaks for you, right? And for her. And I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm really sorry that you went through multiple losses like that, of people who truly, right, have such a deep and unspoken understanding of what it's like to be in your situation. Your sister is one of very few people that really get that in your very close, intimate orbit. And it's devastating that you lost her. I'm really sorry. And I really appreciate what's happened because, or in spite of, or like a catalyst, right? Because of her loss. It's really powerful what's happened. But let me just say, like, it just sucks that we have to go through things like that.
Yeah.
To understand like what our purpose is, right, for moving forward. For you, losing your sister made this book into reality. For many in our adoptee circles, right, this theme of loss is a really big catalyst for a lot of the work that drives us. And we shouldn't have to go through that, and I'm sorry that you did.
We shouldn't have to, but it's this really interesting thing, in that if I hadn't had all these things happen, I wouldn't have written the book. I wouldn't have, I think in a way it's almost like, that, the phoenix has to rise through the ashes from the fire, right? Sometimes I think sometimes I have gratitude for the fire. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The fire burns us and it's horrible, but also when we can rise from it and find, like, walk a path of truth as a result of going through really, really horrible things. And that you have been through just devastating trauma. And then out of that is born incredible hope, right? Through your work. And I don't know if that work would have happened if there hadn't been the fire. Does that make sense? And it's not to say that I want anybody to be on fire, but for us, it allows us to see things in a very different way. The pain allows us to see a truth.
Exactly. It drives our bigger purpose. And I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. It's why, I have felt very connected to you since the beginning. since we first met like over a year ago. Um, I really appreciate, right, that you can see that in our community and that you're a big part of encouraging that, not only through your book, but I have seen and heard you speak and be on different platforms, sharing this very message. And it's so important that we continue to encourage each other and to continue to encourage, right, this change to happen, by empowering each other. So really appreciate you, Becca. And what I wanted to do was talk a little bit with you, um, to kind of, set us up for our conversation about your book, which I think you're going to read a little part of. But I'd love to hear, from your own words, some of what you want to highlight about the adoption history in this country and how that's impacted by our reproductive rights in this country.
Yeah. So after, these doors were shutting in my face, when I was like, oh, I need to find my biological family to get answers about myself and my sister's life. I just started doing Google searches for anything that had been written on adoption, and I was kind of drawn towards academic histories, right? Because that's what I knew. That's how I felt comfortable. Those were sort of the texts that I'd been living in, and so I basically read everything that had in academia that had been written about policy and practice of adoption over the last 100 years in the United States. And a couple things, there's not much. That was my first takeaway. I'm like, okay, there's like 4 people who've written on this and it's 10 books. And now, right, there is this groundswell and things are changing, but 4 years ago, there wasn't much. And the other thing that two things just absolutely stuck out to me while I was reading these histories. One, nobody who was writing these stories was adopted. So I'm like, that's a problem, because I know about positionality, right? We know about when you're telling the story, there's no objectivity, right? We sit in subjectivity. We tell stories from what we know. And if you aren't of that community, it changes the narrative. And you have to really work hard to center the story from the voices of the people who have lived through that. And so I found it really problematic that none of these histories were written by adoptees or foster care alums. And then the other thing that shook me was nobody talked about fertility. Nobody talked about gender, about female identity. And as I was writing this book, we were sort of walking towards the Dobbs decision. Mm-hmm. The writing was on the wall, 2021. It was a very precarious time. And I just kept coming back to fertility sits in the center of all of this, right? And it's a power play around whose bodies are valued, whose identities are valued to produce, who's shamed for reproducing, who's not shamed for reproducing. And in the history, it wasn't the conversation. And so I just started weaving that in, I knew that was a really important part of the story. And then I finished the final chapter right after the Dobbs decision came down. And I was just so angry and terrified about that implications, because I knew that what we were going to start seeing and what we're seeing now is a reverse back to really, really abusive practices when women don't have the autonomy to make choices around their own bodies and around their identities of whether they want to be a mother or not be a mother.
Yeah, but that really hits home, right, to why your book and the knowledge of the history of the system is so important, because as we enter adulthood and we have the opportunity to make our voices heard through who we elect into local offices, who we elect into national offices. Like, this stuff is really important. And especially if you care about what happens to adoptees, what happens to people within the child welfare system, the youth in their current now, what happens to the families that are impacted by the child welfare system, some and many, I should say, who have, their kids torn away from them for, because of various policies. So like, this stuff is so critical to understand what's happening and what's driving these decisions. And I should note for our audience, right, this is being recorded the day before our presidential election. So this is hot on our minds right now. But regardless of time of year, regardless of what is happening in politics, I think, I speak for both of us when I say, like, if you care about what's happening to us, adoptees, foster alumni, people impacted, you care about the future youth, right, who are adopted or who are fostered, you care about the parents and the families who foster and adopt kids, like, these decisions are important, and the decisions are made by people who are elected into office.
Yeah.
So all that being said, right, that decision in 2021 was very critical,
Yeah.
not just for our communities, but for women and people who identify as women as a whole, and people who are able to reproduce through their bodies as a whole. Like, this is super critical, what happened.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for sharing a little bit about the history of adoption as you were researching it, and how it impacts, right, our reproductive rights and policies now. So talk to us a little bit about your book, which is called, and I'm going to put it on the screen for everybody, Who is a Worthy Mother? An Intimate History of Adoption. Would love to hear a little bit of some of the highlights that you would like to mention about, what you want our audience to really take away from your book.
Well, I think I'm just going to read a short blurb from the opening chapter. Just kind of distills what I found doing kind of a longitudinal century study of changing, evolving practices and experiences in different communities around adoption. The historical foundation of adoption in the United States is defined by abusive practices that expose our culture's continuing deep distrust of women, particularly poor women, women of color, and the paradoxical threat and power women's fertility pose to hegemonic societal norms. Millions of women in this country have been told that they may not keep their babies, or have been forcibly sterilized so that they do not have more children. They have been resoundingly told they are unworthy of being mothers. At the same time, women repeatedly hear the message that they are unworthy if they choose not to mother or cannot have babies. Women, American women, live within the tension of this paradox, which allows only a small window of acceptable motherhood, acceptable womanhood. When adoption is used as a tool by which to legitimize some women as mothers and delegitimize others, it becomes profoundly traumatizing. And I just, thinking about fertility, some of the stories I weave in are not sort of part and parcel of adoption practices and fostering practices, have to involve these policies of sterilization, sort of the flip side of that around fertility, and that those stories around the pervasive sterilization of Black girls and women and Indigenous girls and women in our country, which I write about at length, just absolutely shocked me to my core. Just how long these policies state policies in every state in our country that were based in eugenics. And that these stories are not, I just was astounded that these stories are not part of our awareness, you know? And I think that is what allows for abusive family separation policies to continue when we don't understand the history, and understand how policies that are deeply bigoted, that facilitate family separation, if we don't understand them and the roots of them, then we are already seeing them coming back into place, now that women are once again in this place of not having autonomy over their own bodies in many places in our country. So yeah, I think that I guess one of my biggest hopes with this book is that people are willing to be uncomfortable reading it, right?
Yeah.
And be disturbed reading it, because I think there's also this, I'm an educator and I work with pre-service teachers, and I'm working in public education, and there's this other move happening where people are trying to literally whitewash our understanding of our nation's history because these histories are so uncomfortable, particularly for people who sit in positions of power. And if we don't dive into these stories and center the voices of the communities that have been, on the receiving end of these abusive practices, then we're going to continue to, engage in these practices.
Yeah, that's right. And being uncomfortable is not a bad thing. It means, right, if you are uncomfortable reading a perspective that you've not considered before, right, it means you're doing something positive, actually. You are considering perspectives outside of your own and considering, right, the facts of history that you might have not considered before. And so I love that you bring up that is actually what you do hope for, is that people realize that they are uncomfortable reading this book, because it is very it's a normal reaction to be uncomfortable reading about family separation and policies that are harmful to youth in the system. If you're not uncomfortable reading that, then it's time to, take a step back and ask yourself why you're not uncomfortable reading that, right?
Yeah.
And in our country, capitalism is huge. It's a huge driver. It centers a lot of what everything's centered around, even elections.
Yeah.
And as much as we like to, I will rephrase, as much as we want and desire elections and how laws and policies get shaped in this country, as much as we desire for that to be completely democratic, completely unbiased, completely fair, it's not.
No.
And I think we try really hard as a country, but it's impossible to get it perfect. And so things like capitalism, right, is a driving force behind that unfairness, behind the biases that get filtered into these laws and decisions that impact, to your point, Becca, adoptees and foster alumni and the families that are trying to do good around all of that. And so, yeah, it's so critical to call that out with your book and to give people permission almost to challenge their biases, their assumptions, and their comfort level when
Yeah.
reading about the history. So thanks
I
so
think
much for sharing that.
also, Grace, I'll say, I think a huge piece of that too is just exactly what you are doing with the Inclusion Initiative, where you are centering and making visible adoptees and foster care alum in these capitalistic spaces.
Yeah.
Where I think a lot of people would say, we don't want to talk about that, or I don't want that to be visible, and behind that is you're not invited into this space because it makes people uncomfortable. I mean, I've been in so many places as an adoptee where other people were uncomfortable when I talked about being adopted, right? I think we both can relate to that. And so the antidote to that is to center those folks in public spaces, right? In capitalist spaces.
Yeah.
To push the discomfort, to change what's normal, and to disrupt the conversation, right?
That's right. To disrupt and to change and to normalize, centering us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it will be a slow process, but the more of these kinds of conversations we have, the more companies like the Inclusion Initiative is built, then the more we can progress towards that goal. So that transitions us to a really interesting area of conversation that I wanted to explore with you as well, was, thinking about your career as an educator, now at a university, now as a published author, one time, but almost two times. So you're going to be published twice in the near future. That's so exciting and incredible. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I mean, I hope you're taking time to celebrate that.
I have a lot of work to do on the second book. And I will say, with the second book, I'm writing about the experiences of Native students, and I am not Native. And so that's that place where I have to be really thoughtful in how I enter into that, walk into that world as a white person. And so I'm treading very lightly, and that might take me a little bit more time.
Yeah.
Because I'm an outsider in that space.
And I appreciate you recognizing that and being very clear about that, and realizing, right, that there's many extra layers that you're going to put into place to make sure you're honoring that community and their history and their story. So I have every confidence, right, that you're going to do what needs to be done to center that community in your writing. So but yeah, can't wait to read that one. But back to, your current book and your current experience as a first-time published author. How has all of this kind of impacted you as a professional, especially, right, taking such an intimate look at how this adoptee identity is showing up for you in all aspects of your life, but including in your work as an educator, as an author? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been incredibly uncomfortable. And it's not something I intended to do, right? Like I've got my doctorate in 2017, and my intention was to teach in higher education and work in schools of education, work with pre-service teachers. That's my passion. That's what I love. And I really struggled with sharing this story in that space because I didn't know if I would be accepted. It was really scary when the press took on publishing the book, because it's not traditionally the story that a a historian would tell, right? The field of history, you're supposed to be very distant from what you read about, right? And I think there's a change away from that, which is good, but it felt very risky to me. And I can say now, I felt really embraced and supported by the amazing people I work with in school of education at my university, and by the university in general. But it's not traditionally what the work I, was supposed to write. That makes sense. It's deeply personal, and it's in many ways way outside of education, although really informed by my work in education. And it's like really personal, I write about giving birth and all these things and feeling, really terrible about myself, right? And then my students are reading it, and then I'm standing in class and they're telling me they read the book, and it's like standing in front of people totally naked, and it's so uncomfortable. And again, I'm going to go back to, I wouldn't have done this if my sister hadn't died. I wouldn't have written this book because it's just way too scary and vulnerable. But because she died, I had to write it. I know that sounds really cheesy, but it's absolutely true. Like, I had to write it. And I was like, I don't know if we can swear on the podcast, Grace, but I'm going to swear. I was like, I have to tell this story. I don't care. I'm at the point, I'm also almost 50. So I'm like, I don't care. This is me. Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
This is what I think. I'm done trying to please other people. And I think if you're in a good space, surrounded by a good community, they're like, yeah, that's awesome. And that's how I feel, supported by the place where I work in, by my friends and my community. And that feels so good. But I think we both have to acknowledge there are people and places that wouldn't champion us bravely telling our stories.
Right.
And I also say that for transracial adoptees, and transnational adoptees, it is especially vulnerable. You're in a different place. I sit in a lot
we're
of
less
white
able to
privilege.
hide physically.
Yeah. And I can hide, and I can choose to let it out and not, but I have a lot of privilege in that identity. So I'm really aware of that too.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And that's the light out of all of this, right? Is that this work came to be, and our community feels more seen and more heard, and we understand more about our history because someone like you took the time to center the adoptee perspective and experience and share it with the world. So really appreciate all of this, all that you've done. And I want to actually transition to our next segment, which is, I did warn you about this, but it's the rapid fire questions that I did not send to you ahead of time because I just want you to say the first thing that comes up for you.
Okay. Wow.
And it just helps our audience just learn a little bit more about you and have a little fun. So I'm going to ask you 5 questions, okay? And just share the first thing that comes to you. And I hope that you have fun with this too. You ready to go?
Okay. I'm ready.
All right. Favorite food?
Oh, sushi.
Yeah. Oh, nice. What is your superpower as an adoptee?
Empathy.
Yeah, that's a good one. What did you dream of doing when you were a kid?
I wanted to be a rhinestone cowgirl.
Oh, I love that. I would not have guessed that. That is wonderful. See how fun this is.
Yeah.
Okay. What's one thing on your bucket list?
To go scuba diving with my whole family. Well, with my husband and my children. We did it once, and I want to do it again.
Ooh,
Be
like a
all
location
together
in
under
mind?
the water. I would love to go to Belize. Go diving in Belize.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Okay,
My
let's
girls.
manifest it so that it happens sooner rather than later. Great. And then final question. What is a piece of advice that you want to share with our audience?
Know that your vulnerability is your strength. And lean into both of those.
Yeah.
And share yourself, share your story, share who you are bravely and vulnerably.
Yeah. That resonates with me so much. Becca, it was so great to have you. Thank you again for taking the time to be a guest on our show. Will you share a little bit about where people can find your book and where they can find you?
Yeah. So the book is available everywhere. It's also, so a lot of independent bookstores have it. It's available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. But please check independent bookstores. Grace and I did a talk together at Loyalty Books in Washington, D.C. So I know they have it, which is an amazing bookstore run by an adoptee of color. Amazing, amazing person. It's also it's available on Audible and all. If you want to listen to it, you don't want to read it, you can listen to it on all streaming platforms. And you can find me, the best place to go is my website, RebeccaWellington.com. And from there, you can find all my socials and everything else.
That's great. Yes, and we have your website showing on the screen right now. To our wonderful audience, thank you for joining us. We will have all of Rebecca's information in the show notes. And please remember to like, follow, and share this podcast if you enjoyed this conversation. And we will see you all next time. Take care, everybody. Bye. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe, share, and follow us. Check out our show notes to know where to find us on social. And our website is theinclusioninitiative.com. If you're an adoptee of color or a foster care alum and you want to join our professional community, it's free, by the way, hit me up via DM or you can find our email in the show notes. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.